They started dividing my estate while I was still at the table. No one whispered. No one checked if I was listening. My son Daniel talked about timelines. My daughter-in-law Laura asked which accounts would move first and whether the house should be transferred before things got complicated. I kept my hands around my glass so they wouldn't see them shake. I wasn't sick. I wasn't confused. I was sitting in the chair I'd paid for in the house I'd built, listening to them plan a future that started the moment I stopped being an obstacle. At one point, Daniel said, "We should handle it now while she's calm." That's when it hit me. They weren't preparing for someday. They had already decided I was on my way out, and in their version of the story, I wasn't their mother anymore. I was paperwork that hadn't been signed yet.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
After that dinner, nothing exploded. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, everything stayed calm, clean, polite. They still set a place for me at the table, still asked if I wanted coffee, still called me Mom. On the outside, nothing looked wrong, but every real conversation started happening around me, not with me. Daniel would talk to Laura about the house, the accounts, the timeline. Laura would answer him without even glancing in my direction. If I opened my mouth, Daniel would give me that careful smile and say, "We'll go over it later, Mom." Later never came. They talked about repairs in the kitchen, about refinancing, about which room would become a guest suite once everything settled. My name kept coming up, but never as someone in the room, more like a file that hadn't been closed yet. At one point, Laura asked, "Should we move everything before summer?" Daniel shrugged and said, "Depends how things go." I sat there stirring my coffee long after the spoon stopped making noise. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked what I planned. It wasn't loud or cruel. That's what made it worse. If they had shouted, I could have defended myself. If they had insulted me, I could have pushed back. But this was quiet, efficient, organized, like they were already managing the aftermath of something that hadn't happened yet. When friends called, Daniel would answer from the other room and say, "She's resting." I wasn't resting. I was reading in the living room. When the lawyer left a message, Laura told him she'd handle it. When I asked what needed handling, she said, "Just paperwork." Always paperwork. Always something that didn't require my input. One afternoon, I walked into the den and they stopped talking mid-sentence. Not abruptly, smoothly, like professionals. Daniel changed the subject to the weather. Laura asked if I wanted tea. I stood there for a second too long, holding the doorframe, feeling like I'd stepped into the wrong house. Then I said no and went back to the kitchen. That was when I understood it wasn't about one dinner conversation. It was already a system. They weren't waiting for me to leave the room anymore. They were comfortable speaking over me, around me, through me. Decisions were being made and placed neatly on a shelf somewhere out of my reach. My opinions were treated like sentimental clutter, something you keep out of respect but don't actually use. Daniel started using phrases like, "when everything transitions," and "once things are simplified." Simplified meant me, my accounts, my house, my role. Laura began sending emails and copying him, never copying me. When I asked about it, she smiled and said, "Oh, I didn't want to overwhelm you. I had managed businesses, properties, and payrolls for 30 years. But suddenly, I was someone who might get overwhelmed by a simple email. I noticed small things disappearing. Statements that used to come to me now went straight to Daniel. Calls from the bank were returned by him before I even heard the phone ring. One day, I went to check a file drawer and found it reorganized. Labels changed, folders moved, nothing missing, just rearranged. Like someone preparing for a transition they believed was already underway. They didn't hate me. They didn't argue with me. They didn't even seem impatient. They had already adjusted to a version of life where I wasn't part of the decision-making anymore, where my presence was temporary, where my signature was the last step, not the first. That realization didn't come with a dramatic moment. It came slowly in quiet rooms, in half-finished conversations, in polite smiles that closed doors without making a sound. I started to notice how often they used the word we, not we, including me. A different we, a smaller circle that I wasn't inside. One night, Daniel said, "We just want everything to be smooth." I asked, "For who?" He paused like the question surprised him. Then he said, "For everyone." Everyone didn't include me. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, trying to pinpoint when exactly I had moved from being the center of this family to being something they were managing. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, careful, almost respectful. And that was the part that hurt the most. They weren't pushing me out. They were already living as if I had stepped aside. I wasn't a problem to solve. I wasn't even a conflict. I was a formality waiting to be completed. That was the moment I stopped wondering if I was overreacting. I wasn't. I wasn't being sensitive. I wasn't imagining things. I was watching my own role in this family shrink in real time, neatly folded and placed somewhere out of sight. They didn't hate me. They had already replaced me. I didn't go looking for proof. That's important. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't checking phones or digging through drawers. I still wanted to believe I was wrong. That maybe I was reading too much into things. That maybe I was just feeling older and more sensitive than usual. The truth found me on a random Tuesday afternoon. Daniel had asked me to grab a folder from the home office, old insurance paperwork, stuff he said he needed for reference. The door was already open. I stepped inside, went straight to the filing cabinet, and that's when I heard Laura's voice from the hallway. She didn't know I was there. She was on the phone, not whispering, not hiding, just talking the way people do when they're confident the room is empty. She said, "No, once everything's transferred, we won't need to keep her here. That's the whole point." I froze. My hand was still on the drawer handle. There was a pause. Then she laughed softly and said, I know, it sounds harsh, but let's be realistic. She's not going to notice half of it anyway." I didn't hear the rest right away. My ears started ringing. I remember staring at a framed photo on the shelf. Daniel at 12. Missing tooth. Arm around my waist. I remember thinking how strange it was that the room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls had moved closer without making a sound. Then Daniel spoke. From the other end of the hall. Calm. Normal. "She doesn't need to know the details," he said. "We just need her signature. After that, it's done." Done. That word landed harder than anything else. Not settled, not organized. Done. Like I was a task. Like something that had been dragging on too long. I didn't walk out. I didn't interrupt. I stayed exactly where I was, holding my breath, listening like I wasn't supposed to exist. Laura said, "I just don't want this to turn into a whole thing. You know how she gets." How I get. Daniel replied, "It won't. She won't push back. She never does." That's when I felt it. Not shock. Not sadness. Something colder. Something clearer. They weren't guessing. They were confident. This wasn't a conversation about possibilities. It wasn't a rough plan or a backup idea. This was already decided. They were just managing the timing. Managing me. I backed out of the room quietly. Too quietly. My foot caught the edge of the rug, and for a second, I thought I might fall. I grabbed the wall to steady myself. Neither of them noticed. The conversation kept going. My name came up again. Casually. Like a label on a box. I went to the kitchen and sat down. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic. I just felt very awake. For years, I had told myself that families don't think this way, that even when things get messy, there's still some line people don't cross. I realized in that moment that I had been wrong. They hadn't crossed the line. They had quietly moved it. What hurt the most wasn't that they wanted my money. That part was obvious now. What hurt was how small they believed I had become, how easy they thought it would be. She won't even notice. That sentence kept replaying in my head, over and over. I noticed. I noticed everything. I noticed how carefully they chose their words around me, how conversations stopped when I entered a room, how decisions were announced instead of discussed. I noticed how comfortable they were assuming I wouldn't fight back. And in that moment, standing alone in my kitchen, I finally understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were waiting for me to disappear quietly. And the worst part? They truly believed I would let them. I sat there for a long time after that, just sitting, staring at the counter like it might explain something I'd missed. I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I heard one sentence out of context. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. That's what I'd always done, given them the benefit of the doubt, smoothed things over in my own head so I wouldn't rock the boat. But the more I replayed it, the clearer it became. There was no missing context, no misunderstanding. They weren't speaking emotionally. They weren't angry. They were organized, calm, certain. That scared me more than shouting ever could. When Daniel walked into the kitchen later, he acted normal, asked if I found the folder, asked if I wanted dinner early or late. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't avoid mine. That told me everything I needed to know. People only act that comfortable when they believe the situation is already under control. I handed him the folder. He thanked me, kissed my cheek. I felt absolutely nothing. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was crying, because my mind wouldn't slow down. I started replaying years instead of moments. Every time I'd signed something without reading closely, every time I'd said, "If you think that's best," every time I'd chosen peace over questions, I saw how easily cooperation turns into permission if you're not careful. By morning, something had shifted. I wasn't panicked anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was alert. They thought I was passive. They thought I was tired. They thought I was already halfway gone. What they didn't understand was this. I had spent my entire life building things quietly. I knew paperwork. I knew systems. I knew how power actually moves when no one is yelling. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about how to fix the family dynamic. I started thinking about how to protect myself. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask questions. I didn't let them know I'd heard a single word. I smiled when expected. I nodded when appropriate. I played the role they already believed I was in, because now I knew something they didn't. They thought the truth would break me. It didn't. It woke me up. It didn't take long for them to change their approach. Once they realized I wasn't rushing to sign anything, the pressure started. Quiet at first, polite, almost caring. Daniel sat me down one morning at the kitchen table like we were having a normal conversation. Coffee poured, tone calm. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about the future." Not your future, just the future. He said things like, "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." And, "This is about protecting everyone." Everyone again. That word kept doing a lot of work. Laura joined in a few minutes later, acting like it was all spontaneous. She leaned against the counter and said, "You've worked so hard your whole life. You shouldn't have to worry about details anymore." Details meant control. She said, "Let us take some of that weight off you." Weight meant responsibility, and responsibility meant power. I asked a simple question. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced at Laura. Then he said, "Just sign a few things. Temporary. So things don't get messy later." Temporary. Later. Messy. All words designed to make me feel unreasonable for hesitating. When I didn't respond, Laura's tone shifted. Still calm, but sharper. "This is how families like ours handle things," she said. "It's normal. Families like ours. as if money rewrites loyalty, as if wealth comes with its own rule book where parents quietly step aside when it's convenient. They started bringing it up everywhere, not directly, indirectly, at dinner, in the car, while watching TV. Have you thought about the paperwork? The lawyer's availability is limited. We don't want this to turn into a problem. Every sentence carried the same message: cooperate now or regret it later. Then came the guilt. Daniel said, I just don't want this to get ugly. Ugly meant conflict. Ugly meant me standing my ground. He said, you know how stressful this is for Laura. As if my hesitation was hurting her. As if my money was already hers to worry about. When that didn't work, they moved to concern. Laura said, we're just worried about you. She said it slowly, carefully. You forget things sometimes. I asked her to give an example. She smiled and said, see, you're getting defensive. That's how it works. Question them, and it becomes proof you're unstable. A week later, Daniel said something he couldn't take back. We were alone. He said, don't make this difficult, Mom. Not angry, not loud, just flat. Final, like a warning. Like I was a problem standing between him and something he felt entitled to. That sentence sat heavy in the room, because it wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about obedience. They started implying consequences without spelling them out. We'll have to rethink some arrangements. We might need to adjust schedules. Things could change. I knew what that meant. Less access, less inclusion, less family time. Love turned into leverage. The worst part was how reasonable they sounded while doing it. No shouting, no threats you could point to, just pressure wrapped in concern, control dressed up as responsibility. Every conversation ended with the same expectation that I would eventually give in, because I always had before. I went to bed each night replaying their words, trying to figure out when my role had shifted from mother to obstacle. I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't asking. They were informing me. They believed the decision had already been made. All that was missing was my compliance. And underneath all of it was one clear message they never said out loud, but made sure I felt. If I didn't cooperate, I wouldn't just lose control of my money. I would lose my place in the family. That's when I understood exactly what this was. Not a discussion, not a plan, an ultimatum. After that, they stopped pretending it was optional. The next set of papers showed up on the table without explanation, neatly stacked, tabs marked with sticky notes. Daniel tapped the top page and said, it's standard. Standard for who? Not for me. I asked for time to read everything. He said, of course. But his face tightened in that small way people don't notice unless they're looking for it. Laura started bringing up practical things. If something happens suddenly, we need access. Banks can freeze accounts. You don't want strangers making decisions. Every sentence was framed like protection, but it all led to the same place. Sign now, ask fewer questions, trust us completely. They began scheduling things without asking me. We set a meeting with the attorney for Thursday. Not, does Thursday work? Just information delivered like a calendar reminder. When I said I wasn't sure I was ready, Daniel sighed. Long and slow, not dramatic, just enough to signal disappointment. He said, we're trying to do this the easy way. The easy way for them meant control. The easy way for me meant surrender. One evening, Laura said, we just need clarity. That word, clarity, kept coming up, as if my hesitation was creating confusion in their plans, as if my assets were already part of their structure, and I was delaying construction. Daniel added, we can't move forward until this is settled. Move forward. Without me, apparently. I started noticing how quickly kindness disappeared the moment I didn't agree. Invitations became shorter, conversations more functional, They still smiled, still hugged me, still said, "Love you," but everything felt conditional. Like approval was tied to cooperation. They weren't yelling, they weren't threatening. They were tightening the circle, slowly, carefully. And they believed I would step into the center of it and sign. I didn't argue. That surprised them. After weeks of pressure, they were expecting a scene, tears, questions, maybe even a fight. That's what people prepare for when they push this hard. They prepare for resistance. What they don't know how to handle is quiet. So I stopped reacting. When Daniel brought up the paperwork, I nodded. When Laura talked about timelines, I said, "I hear you." I didn't agree. I didn't refuse. I didn't ask for more information. I just stopped giving them anything to work with. No emotion, no pushback, no reassurance either. At first, they thought it meant I was finally giving in. I could see the relief in their faces, the way Daniel relaxed his shoulders, the way Laura started speaking more confidently about next steps. They assumed silence meant acceptance. That's the mistake people make when they underestimate you. I wasn't accepting anything. I was watching. I started paying attention to how they spoke when they thought I wasn't listening, which accounts they mentioned, which deadlines mattered to them, who they were calling behind closed doors. When you stop reacting, people get comfortable. They reveal more than they realize. Silence makes them talk to fill the space. A few days later, Daniel asked, "Did you get a chance to look over the documents?" I said, "Not yet." He waited for an explanation. I didn't give one, just sipped my tea and looked at him. That made him uncomfortable, not angry, uncomfortable, like he'd lost control of the rhythm. Laura tried a different tactic, extra kindness. She started bringing me coffee in the morning, asking if I needed anything from the store, checking in on my energy levels. It would have been sweet if it hadn't felt so strategic. She was testing the waters, trying to figure out if my silence meant weakness or something else. I let them wonder. One evening, Daniel said, "We don't want this to drag on." I looked at him and said, "Neither do I." Then I went back to reading. No argument, no explanation, just a statement. That's when I saw it. The first flicker of uncertainty. He didn't know what I meant. He didn't know what I was planning. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't in complete control. Silence does that. It shifts the balance. They started repeating themselves more, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. "Did you speak to the lawyer? Do you want us to schedule something? Are you feeling okay about everything?" Each question was really the same question. "Are you going to cooperate?" I kept my answers neutral. "I'm thinking. I'll let you know. We'll see." No emotion, no urgency, no commitment. It unsettled them. I could tell. People who rely on pressure need a reaction to measure progress. Without one, they start guessing, and guessing makes them nervous. A week went by, then another. The papers stayed on the table. I didn't move them, I didn't sign them, I didn't bring them up either. They sat there like a test no one could force me to take. Daniel finally said, "Mom, we just need clarity." I looked at him and said, "You'll have it when I'm ready." Calm, even, final. He didn't push after that, not right away. He just nodded slowly like he was recalculating. That's when I realized something important. They weren't afraid of my anger. They were afraid of losing access. As long as I argued, they felt in control. Arguments are predictable. They have a shape. They end with someone giving in. But silence? Silence creates space. And in that space, people start to worry. Laura became more careful with her words. Daniel started watching me when he thought I wouldn't notice. They were trying to read me, trying to figure out if I was still the same person they thought they could manage. I was, but I wasn't. I stopped volunteering information, stopped sharing my plans, stopped explaining my schedule. If I had an appointment, I didn't say where. If I made a call, I took it in another room. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts. enough to remind them that access works both ways. One afternoon, Daniel said, "You're being very quiet." I said, "I'm thinking." He asked, "About what?" I said, "Everything." Then I left the room. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. They still believed they were guiding the situation, but they were starting to feel something they hadn't felt before: uncertainty. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for emotion. They had planned for negotiation. What they hadn't planned for was a version of me that didn't react at all. And the more I stayed calm, the more unsettled they became. Because without my cooperation, their timeline meant nothing. Without my signature, their plans were just plans. That's when it finally hit me. Silence scared them more than anger ever could. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn them. I just started moving quietly. They thought my silence meant I was slowing down. It didn't. It meant I was finally thinking clearly. When you stop reacting, you get time back. And time lets you see what matters. The first call I made was to my lawyer, not the one Daniel preferred, not the one who had been CC'd on emails I never asked for. My lawyer. Someone who had known me for years. Someone who understood that family planning doesn't always mean protection. Sometimes it means pressure. I didn't tell Daniel I was calling. I didn't ask Laura for a ride. I drove myself, sat in a waiting room that smelled like coffee and paper and old carpet. When my lawyer walked in, he didn't ask why I was there. He just said, "What do you need?" That question mattered. Not what do they need, not what's the problem. What do you need? I told him everything. The conversations, the pressure, the documents, the way they spoke about timelines like I wasn't part of them. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't cry. I just laid it out the way you lay out facts when you're done pretending things are fine. He listened, took notes. Then he asked one question. "Do you still want them in control?" That answer came easily. No. We went over everything. Accounts, property, trusts, signatures, access points. He explained what had already been set up and what could be changed. Not emotionally, legally, calmly. That's what I needed. Not reassurance, clarity. I didn't move anything right away. I just started adjusting the structure. Small changes first, then bigger ones. Names shifted, permissions tightened, backup plans replaced old ones. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just a different direction. The key was timing. They believed they were managing the process. They had no idea the process was moving somewhere else. I kept showing up at dinner, kept answering politely, kept letting them think I was considering everything. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything. Dates, conversations, requests. You learn a lot when you stop assuming people will act in your best interest. Daniel asked one afternoon if I'd scheduled anything with the attorney. I said, "Not yet." That wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie either. I just didn't explain what anything meant anymore. Laura started asking if I needed help with paperwork. I told her I was handling it. She smiled like she didn't quite believe me. That was fine. Belief wasn't required. Over the next couple of weeks, I met with the bank, quietly, reviewed access, adjusted authorizations, clarified who could do what and when. Again, nothing illegal, just precise. If you've spent a lifetime building something, you learn how to protect it without making noise. I didn't rush. I didn't stall either. I just moved steadily. The most important part wasn't the documents, it was the boundaries. Once I understood how they saw me as a step in their timeline, I stopped trying to change their perspective. I focused on changing my position. Daniel kept asking for updates. "Any progress?" I'd say, "I'm working through it." Laura would ask if I wanted her to review anything. I'd say, "No, thank you." Polite, neutral, closed. One morning I noticed something different. Daniel stopped bringing up deadlines. Laura stopped mentioning the lawyer. They were waiting, watching, trying to figure out where things stood. That uncertainty? It shifted the energy in the house. They still believed I would eventually sign something that gave them what they wanted. They just didn't know when, or what, or how much control I still had. And that was the point. I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to make sure I didn't disappear inside my own life. The final meeting with my lawyer was short. We reviewed the updated structure, confirmed the changes, locked things in. He asked if I felt comfortable. I said yes, not because everything was perfect, because everything was clear. When I walked out of that office, nothing about my day looked different. I went to the grocery store, came home, made dinner, sat at the same table with the same people who believed they were still guiding the future. They had no idea the future had already shifted. I didn't tell them, not yet. Some things don't need to be announced right away. Some changes work best when they stay quiet. The truth didn't explode. It landed quietly. Daniel found out because the lawyer called him back. He'd left a message asking about next steps. The call didn't go the way he expected. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I heard the change in his voice when he hung up. Not loud, just tight. He came into the kitchen holding his phone like it had betrayed him. "Mom," he said, careful and slow, "did you change something?" I kept slicing an apple. "I updated a few things," I said. He waited for more. I didn't give it. Laura walked in a minute later, already reading his face. "What's going on?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me like he was trying to figure out how much I knew, how long I'd known it, how far it had gone. Finally, he said, "The structure's different." Not angry, not yet, just confused, disoriented, like the ground had shifted under him and he hadn't felt it happen. Laura's tone changed first. "Different how?" she asked, sharp, focused. She picked up the stack of papers on the counter, flipping through them like answers might be hiding between the pages. They weren't. Daniel asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "You didn't ask." That landed harder than I expected. He blinked. Laura stopped flipping pages. The room got very still. They weren't yelling. They weren't accusing. They were calculating. I could see it. Running through options, trying to understand what had changed and what hadn't, what they still had access to, what they'd lost. Laura asked, "Is this permanent?" I said, "Yes." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that stretches until someone breaks it. Daniel finally said, "We were just trying to make things easier for everyone." I nodded. "I know," I said. He waited for an argument, for emotion, for something he could respond to. I didn't give him that. I just kept standing there calm, present, not apologizing, not explaining beyond what was necessary. Laura shifted tactics. Softer voice. "We're family," she said. "We should be making these decisions together." Together. That word again. I asked, "Were we?" She didn't answer. Daniel rubbed his forehead, sat down, looked older all of a sudden, not because of the paperwork, because control had slipped without a fight. There's something unsettling about realizing someone you thought was passive has been moving quietly the whole time. He said, "This changes things." I said, "Yes." No drama, no victory, just acknowledgement. They didn't ask why. They asked how to fix it. Laura wanted to know if anything could be reconsidered. Daniel asked if we could review options. Options meant reversing it, restoring the version of the future they'd already planned. I told them there was nothing to review. That's when the confusion turned into something else. Not rage. Not exactly. More like a loss of footing. They had been moving toward a destination they felt certain about. Now the map was different. Daniel said, "We just need to understand where we stand." I said, "You stand exactly where you always did." That answer frustrated him because he knew it wasn't true anymore. They stood in a place with fewer guarantees, fewer assumptions, fewer quiet expectations. Laura asked if this meant they couldn't help manage things. I said, I'm managing them. Calm, direct, final. The conversation ended without a clear resolution. No shouting, no slam doors, just a quiet recognition that something had shifted and wasn't shifting back. They went to their room. I stayed in the kitchen, finished my apple, washed the knife, put everything away. That night, the house felt different. Not tense, just aware. Like everyone was adjusting to a new reality that hadn't been fully explained yet. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't come to argue. They came to figure out how to undo it, but there was nothing to undo. They thought the reveal would be dramatic, a confrontation, a showdown. It wasn't. It was a conversation that ended with them realizing they weren't in control of the timeline anymore. And maybe they never had been. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't something being planned around me. It was something I was still part of. After that, things got quiet, not peaceful, just honest. They stopped bringing up timelines, stopped sliding papers across the table. We still had dinner, still talked about normal things. But something had changed. They looked at me differently, not like a step in their plan, like a person again. No one apologized. I didn't ask for one. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. They knew I had heard them. I knew they had assumed too much. That was enough. The money didn't fix anything. The paperwork didn't heal anything. It just revealed what was already there. I didn't cut them off. I didn't punish them. I just stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I kept my boundaries, kept my voice calm, kept my life mine. They thought they were waiting for my ending. I was just waiting for clarity. Inheritance didn't change them. It showed me who they were, and I chose peace.
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.